What if the man who built his entire image around strength is now the most frightened person in Russia? And what if the people who helped him rise to power are the same ones now planning how to remove him? Before we go further, tap that like button, subscribe to this channel, and share this video with someone who wants to understand what is really happening inside Russia right now, not just what state media wants the world to believe. Let's begin. There is a strange kind of leader who spends decades building an image of total control, only to end up trapped by his own myth. That is exactly where we find ourselves right now. A man who has ruled for over 2 decades, who built his entire reputation on stability and strength, is now surrounded by signs that his grip on power is slipping. And the most telling part is not what his enemies are saying about him. It is what his own closest allies are starting to do. Let's start with something simple but deeply revealing. Over the past several years, a strange and disturbing pattern has emerged. Dozens of senior business figures, executives connected to some of Russia's largest energy and financial companies, have died under circumstances that raise serious questions. Some of these deaths were labeled as suicides. Others were described as tragic accidents, falls from windows, sudden heart failures, car crashes with no clear explanation. On their own, any one of these cases might be dismissed as coincidence, but when you add them together, year after year, across the same industries, tied to the same broader political moment, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Why would this be happening? One possible explanation is chilling in its simplicity. Some of these individuals may have known too much. They may have seen how deeply this war has damaged the country's economy from the inside. They may have tried to speak up, tried to push back, tried to protect the businesses and industries they spent their entire careers building. And in a system where loyalty is enforced through fear rather than trust, speaking up carries enormous risk. This fits into a much larger and more human story. A leader who came to power almost by accident, chosen by a predecessor during a moment of political uncertainty in the late 1990s, not because he was widely known or beloved, but because he seemed useful and controllable at the time. That unlikely path to power created a debt, a network of powerful people who helped elevate him from an unknown figure into the presidency. For over 2 decades, that network has protected him and profited alongside him. But now, that same network appears to be sensing weakness for the first time. Here is something worth remembering. This ruling system was never actually built on genuine popularity. It was built on an unspoken agreement. Ordinary citizens gave up meaningful political freedom in exchange for basic stability, predictable daily life, and the promise that their lives would not be disrupted by chaos. For roughly 2 decades, that agreement mostly held. People could go to work, raise families, and avoid thinking too deeply about politics, as long as their daily routines remained undisturbed. But war breaks agreements like that. And this war, stretching on far longer and far more painfully than anyone in power ever expected, has quietly shattered that unspoken deal. The promise of stability has been replaced by economic strain, fuel shortages, internet blackouts, and a growing sense that ordinary daily life is no longer protected from the consequences of decisions made at the very top. A similar agreement existed with the country's wealthiest business figures, the oligarchs who built enormous fortunes during the chaotic transition decades ago. Their arrangement was simple: stay out of politics and military decisions, and in exchange, you get to keep building your wealth without interference. That deal worked well for both sides for a very long time, but now that arrangement is under serious strain too. Reports increasingly suggest that many of these wealthy elites have been quietly moving significant amounts of money out of the country over the past year. This is not a small or subtle trend. It is happening at a scale large enough that international observers and financial analysts have started paying close attention. Because of international sanctions, moving money through traditional banking channels in Europe and North America has become extremely difficult. So instead, funds are reportedly being routed through alternative pathways, moving through countries in the South Caucasus, then onward toward Gulf nations, and eventually into markets across parts of Africa and Asia where scrutiny is lower. Why would people who have spent decades benefiting from this system suddenly start protecting their wealth by moving it elsewhere? The answer is simple and deeply telling. They are afraid. Not necessarily afraid of losing money through market forces or economic downturn, but afraid of losing it through confiscation. Afraid that the very government they helped build and profit alongside might eventually turn on them directly. And that fear is not irrational. There have already been reported instances of senior business figures, some of them individuals who spent decades considered untouchable due to their personal connections. Many of the fortunes built during the chaotic years after the Soviet collapse were never purely private in the way fortunes work in most Western economies. They were built through close personal relationships with political power, favorable access to state contracts, and privileged treatment during the privatization of massive state industries. That means the wealth itself was always somewhat conditional, always dependent on staying inside the good graces of whoever controlled the political system. For most of the last 2 decades, that condition was rarely tested. Now, under the financial strain of a prolonged war, it is being tested constantly, and many of these individuals are discovering just how fragile their protected status actually was. Please take a second right now to hit that subscribe button if you want to understand these deeper political currents, not just the surface-level war updates most channels focus on. This kind of analysis takes real research, and your support genuinely helps keep it going. Let's talk about why this pattern of internal fear matters so much right now, more than at almost any previous point in this conflict. Modern warfare does not stay contained within neat geographic boundaries forever. What began as a war fought almost entirely on Ukrainian soil has increasingly reached deep into Russian territory itself. Drone strikes on fuel refineries, explosions at logistics hubs, direct strikes near the capital. These are no longer rare, isolated incidents. They have become a regular part of daily reality for many Russian regions that had previously felt completely insulated from the consequences of this war. This shift matters enormously because it directly breaks one of the central promises used to justify this entire invasion in the first place. The public justification offered to ordinary citizens was never framed as conquest or expansion. It was framed as protection, a preemptive move meant to keep Russia itself safer from future threats. That was the story told again and again to justify the human and economic cost being asked of ordinary people. But now, look at the actual outcome. More explosions inside Russian territory, not fewer. More fires at critical infrastructure, not fewer. A worsening fuel crisis that has led to shortages, rationing, and export restrictions inside the very country that is one of the largest oil producers in the world. A federal budget under mounting strain from years of unsustainable military spending. Internet shutdowns imposed with increasing frequency, disrupting daily life, business operations, and basic communication for millions of ordinary citizens. If you compare the overall condition of the country now to how things stood before this invasion began, the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. The promise was safety and strength. The result has been growing instability and vulnerability, and more ordinary citizens, not just political analysts or Western observers, are beginning to notice that uncomfortable gap between promise and reality. This creates a particularly dangerous problem for any leader who has built his entire public identity around decisiveness and control. There were reportedly multiple genuine opportunities earlier in this conflict to negotiate an end to the fighting on terms that could have been publicly presented as a meaningful victory. Reasonable off-ramps that would have allowed a face-saving conclusion to the war while still claiming some strategic achievement for domestic audiences. Instead, those opportunities were repeatedly declined, seemingly out of an unwillingness to accept anything less than complete. Total success. Now, that kind of rigid, uncompromising decision-making might project strength in the short term, but it becomes a serious long-term liability when circumstances continue deteriorating year after year. There is also a psychological dimension worth considering here. A leader who has spent decades cultivating an image of always being right, always being several steps ahead, faces enormous internal pressure, never to publicly admit miscalculation. Admitting a strategic mistake this large, one that has cost hundreds of thousands of casualties and inflicted enormous economic damage on his own country, would fundamentally undermine the entire foundation of authority he has spent his career building. So instead of course correcting, the pattern instead becomes one of doubling down, continuing forward, hoping that eventual results will somehow retroactively justify the original decision. This kind of thinking has led many previous leaders throughout history into deeper and deeper strategic holes, precisely because turning back feels more threatening to them personally than continuing forward, even when continuing forward causes greater objective harm. Now let's talk about a moment on the calendar that carries enormous hidden significance, even though it is technically framed as a routine political event. There are scheduled elections coming later this year. Of course, the term election in this context does not carry the same meaning it would in a genuinely competitive democratic system. Everyone paying close attention understands this. The outcome is effectively predetermined, and the process functions more as a carefully managed display of control rather than an actual competitive vote. But even a tightly managed, largely symbolic election can become a serious point of political vulnerability under the right conditions. Here is why. Elections, even heavily controlled ones, require decisions about what numbers to present publicly. And when actual public approval has genuinely declined as significantly as many analysts and even some domestic officials privately suggest, the gap between the officially reported results and the reality on the ground becomes harder to manage convincingly. If that gap becomes too visible, too obvious, it creates a rare moment where public anger might have a clear, tangible trigger to focus around. A moment where ordinary people, even those normally passive due to fear or resignation, might feel emboldened enough to visibly express dissatisfaction. Combine that political stress point with looming fears about a potential large-scale mobilization effort expected sometime after that same election period, and you start to see multiple sources of pressure converging on the same narrow window of time. Economic strain, political theater under scrutiny, fear of forced military service spreading through ordinary households, elite anxiety about personal wealth and safety. All of these pressures appear to be building toward roughly the same period later this year. This is precisely why many analysts increasingly expect the coming months, stretching from summer into autumn, to represent one of the most volatile and unpredictable stretches of this entire conflict, politically speaking. Not necessarily on the battlefield itself. When people imagine what political collapse in a system like this might look like, the first image that often comes to mind is violent, widespread civil conflict, something resembling a chaotic uprising or civil war. But there's a different, historically more common pattern worth considering carefully, a pattern rooted deeply in this specific country's political history. Throughout the 20th century, meaningful political transitions in this region rarely happened through mass public uprising alone. Far more often, they happened through internal palace-style transitions, where a small, powerful inner circle, sometimes tied to the security services, sometimes tied to wealthy business interests, quietly coordinated a change in leadership behind closed doors. Ordinary citizens historically played a much smaller direct role in these transitions, largely because organized civil society movements and grassroots political traditions have been systematically suppressed for generations, making large-scale coordinated public action extremely difficult to organize and sustain. Given that specific historical pattern, a coordinated move led by powerful business elites rather than a chaotic mass uprising appears to be the more historically probable pathway if a serious leadership change were to occur. And the reasoning behind why these elites might eventually take such a drastic step is not particularly complicated once you consider what they stand to lose. These are individuals who have already sacrificed an enormous amount because of this war. Years of international isolation, severe travel restrictions, massive sanctions, cutting them off from global markets and financial systems they once moved through freely. Their personal and professional worlds have been dramatically shrunk compared to where they stood before this invasion began. In exchange for accepting all of that loss, the original unspoken deal promised them continued safety and continued wealth accumulation within Russia's borders, a country blessed with enormous natural resource wealth that should theoretically make maintaining that wealth relatively straightforward. But that is simply not what has been happening. Instead, they are watching state-linked companies that once symbolized extraordinary national wealth and prestige increasingly require government subsidies just to remain operational, because normal business operations and export markets have been so severely disrupted by war and sanctions. They are watching critical industries related to energy, refining, construction, and international trade shrink dramatically compared to pre-war levels. They are watching senior business figures with decades of protected status suddenly face arrest, investigation, or asset seizure, seemingly as leadership searches for new sources of funding to sustain the ongoing war effort. Let's talk specifically about what is happening to two of the most historically significant, symbolically important business entities associated with this country's national wealth and prestige. Major energy companies that once represented the very definition of extraordinary Russian economic power, businesses that made countless fortunes and defined an entire era of post-Soviet prosperity, are now facing serious operational and financial strain. Refineries have suffered extensive damage, export capacity has been severely restricted, and the same industries that once symbolized limitless prosperity are now symbols of vulnerability instead. When facilities tied to these companies get struck and damaged, it certainly represents a serious blow to the broader war economy. But it is worth remembering something important underneath the surface. These are not abstract government assets being damaged. These are specific businesses belonging to specific individuals, people who built enormous personal fortunes over decades, and who are now watching those same fortunes burn, quite literally, because leadership refused to change course even after it became clear the original plan had failed. And that failure, according to many who have studied the earliest stages of this conflict closely, became apparent almost immediately, within the very first weeks of the full-scale invasion. Yet, despite that early clarity, the war continued for years afterward, accumulating enormous additional cost with each passing month. This has led many of these powerful business figures to begin quietly exploring alternatives, relocating significant portions of their wealth outside the country, relocating family members abroad, often to countries with far more stability and far fewer international restrictions. It is worth noting something particularly revealing here. Many members of the leadership's own inner circle, including close family members, have reportedly chosen not to live primarily inside the country themselves for extended periods, despite frequent public rhetoric suggesting hostility toward Western nations and lifestyles. That contradiction reveals something important about how genuine or performative certain public statements might actually be. Take a moment to think about the underlying message this sends. If the people closest to power, the people with the most accurate insider information about how things are truly going, are quietly positioning their own families and their own wealth outside the country's borders, what does that tell you about their genuine confidence in the current system's long-term stability? There's another particularly revealing detail worth examining closely. Several individuals from an older generation of business figures, people whose fortunes and connections trace back specifically to this leader's early career decades ago, individuals who had long enjoyed what amounted to complete legal and political immunity, have recently found themselves formally arrested or imprisoned. For people who had operated under an unspoken guarantee of protection for over 2 decades, watching close peers suddenly lose that protection sends shockwaves through the entire elite network. It signals, quite clearly, that even historical loyalty and personal closeness no longer guarantee safety. Why would leadership suddenly turn against people who have been loyal supporters for decades? One increasingly discussed possibility centers directly on money. Sustaining this war at its current scale requires enormous, continuous funding. As traditional revenue streams shrink due to sanctions and damaged infrastructure, leadership may increasingly need to find new sources of funding, including, uncomfortably, extracting resources directly from wealthy insiders through legal proceedings, asset seizures, or forced financial contributions framed as patriotic duty. Some estimates suggest the total wealth potentially at stake through this kind of pressure campaign could reach into the hundreds of billions of dollars. That is not a minor sum extracted through routine taxation. That represents a fundamental threat to the entire elite wealth structure that has defined this ruling system for over 2 decades. Time now for another moment to pause. If this deeper look into Russia's internal fractures is giving you a clearer picture than what most mainstream coverage offers, drop a comment below sharing your own thoughts, and make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss the next deep dive into what is really happening behind these closed doors. Let's talk now about how internal security services fit into this increasingly unstable picture, because their role adds another layer of complexity worth understanding carefully. This leader's own professional background traces directly back to intelligence and security services, an institution he has maintained extremely close personal ties with throughout his entire political career. Many individuals within these security services owe their own career advancement and personal wealth directly to their historical loyalty toward him specifically. This creates an unusually tight, mutually dependent relationship between political leadership and internal security apparatus, one that differs significantly from more conventional government structures where these institutions maintain clearer separation. Reports increasingly suggest growing friction between different branches of government regarding how to manage this deepening crisis. Some elements, closer to civilian political administration, reportedly favor a more measured, realistic approach, recognizing that increasingly aggressive domestic restrictions, particularly things like repeated internet shutdowns, actively damage public approval and daily economic functioning. Meanwhile, security-focused institutions reportedly continue favoring more aggressive control measures, prioritizing information suppression and security enforcement over practical economic and social consequences. This tension reveals something important about leadership style itself. Someone who came of age professionally during an era before widespread internet use may genuinely struggle to understand its true significance in modern daily life. To someone from that specific generational background, restricting internet access might seem comparable to historical censorship methods from decades past, something akin to simply restricting a single newspaper publication. But that comparison fundamentally misunderstands how deeply internet access has become woven into nearly every aspect of modern economic activity, communication, education, and daily convenience. When leadership implements restrictions based on that kind of outdated understanding, expecting minimal public reaction, but instead triggers genuine widespread frustration and economic disruption, it reveals a deeper, more troubling pattern. A leadership structure increasingly disconnected from the practical realities of how ordinary citizens actually live their daily lives in the modern world. This disconnect between leadership perception and everyday reality represents exactly the kind of vulnerability that historically precedes major political instability. There is one particularly striking recent comment worth highlighting here, one that reveals just how widespread quiet dissatisfaction has become, even reaching surprisingly high levels within institutions traditionally considered firmly loyal to leadership. A senior banking executive, someone leading one of the largest state-affiliated financial institutions in the entire country, reportedly made a notably candid public statement suggesting that the greatest shared hope among senior banking leadership across the country is simply for this ongoing military conflict to finally end. Consider how remarkable that statement actually is. This is not commentary coming from an outside critic or independent journalist. This is coming from someone occupying one of the most senior positions within a state-connected financial institution, someone whose career and position depend directly on maintaining public alignment with official government messaging. When individuals occupying that level of institutional seniority begin publicly expressing sentiments that directly contradict official government messaging, even in carefully measured language, it suggests genuine exhaustion has spread far beyond ordinary critics and independent voices. It suggests that even within institutions specifically designed to project confidence and stability, private exhaustion with this prolonged conflict has become increasingly difficult to fully conceal. However, even a limited, insider-driven change in top leadership could still carry enormous practical significance for how this war actually proceeds moving forward. A new leadership figure, even one drawn directly from the same established elite network, would likely feel considerably less personal ego investment in continuing the specific conflict at its current unsustainable intensity. Someone without the same deeply personal, decades-long emotional attachment to this particular military campaign might prove significantly more willing to pursue a negotiated resolution, primarily as a practical means of protecting remaining economic interests and stabilizing continued elite wealth and control, rather than out of any genuine ideological shift toward peace. This detail matters more than it might initially seem. Practical elite self-interest, protecting wealth, protecting business interests, protecting long-term personal security has historically proven to be a significantly more reliable driver of major political change than idealistic public sentiment alone, particularly within systems that have spent decades systematically eliminating genuine grassroots political organization and civic participation. So, what should we genuinely expect moving forward, based on everything we have carefully examined? Multiple significant sources of pressure appear to be converging within a relatively narrow window of time. Continued economic strain from ongoing sanctions and severely disrupted trade relationships. Direct military and drone strikes reaching increasingly deep into Russian territory itself, no longer confined to distant battlefield regions. A politically sensitive, tightly managed electoral event later this year, one that carries significant symbolic risk regardless of its predetermined outcome. Looming fears surrounding a potential large-scale conscription effort expected to follow shortly afterward. And perhaps, most significantly, a wealthy, historically loyal elite network that increasingly appears to be quietly repositioning itself, both financially and personally, in preparation for increasingly plausible scenarios of serious instability ahead. None of these individual factors alone would necessarily guarantee dramatic political change. Authoritarian systems have historically proven remarkably capable of absorbing sustained pressure and hardship for extended periods without necessarily collapsing entirely. But when multiple significant sources of pressure converge simultaneously within a relatively compressed time frame, historical precedent strongly suggests that the resulting situation becomes considerably more volatile and considerably more difficult to predict with any real confidence. There is one particularly important historical lesson worth remembering as we consider what might come next. Just a few years ago, a rebellion led by a private military contractor and his forces caught nearly everyone by surprise, including experienced political analysts who had studied Russian politics closely for decades. That specific uprising unfolded with remarkable speed, moving from initial mobilization to a serious armed challenge against central authority within a matter of hours, not weeks or months. Ultimately, that particular rebellion did not succeed in removing leadership from power, but it powerfully demonstrated something crucial that many analysts had previously underestimated. Serious internal challenges to authority within the specific political system can emerge with startling suddenness, catching even seasoned observers completely off guard. If a similarly sudden internal challenge were to emerge again, this time originating from within established elite business and security networks, rather than from an independent military contractor operating somewhat outside traditional power structures, there is little reason to assume it would necessarily unfold any more slowly or predictably than that earlier example did. This uncertainty itself represents one of the most important things to understand about the current moment. We genuinely do not know exactly when or precisely how internal pressure might eventually translate into visible political change. What we can observe with much greater confidence, however, is the accumulating weight of contributing factors. Economic strain reaching deeper levels than at any previous point during this entire conflict. Elite confidence and loyalty showing genuine signs of erosion for the first time in over 2 decades. Direct military consequences now reaching deep into Russian territory itself, no longer confined to distant frontline regions, far removed from everyday civilian life, and a political calendar containing built-in moments of genuine vulnerability later this year. None of these individual pressures guarantee a specific dramatic outcome on any particular date, but collectively, they paint a picture of a political system under a level of genuine internal strain unlike anything experienced during the earlier years of this specific war. Systems built primarily around fear, personal loyalty networks, and carefully managed information can often continue functioning outwardly for a surprisingly long time, right up until the specific moment when accumulated internal pressure finally exceeds the system's capacity to contain and manage it. Whether that eventual moment arrives through a sudden internal move orchestrated by wealthy, elite insiders, through unexpected fractures within security services no longer willing to enforce increasingly unpopular domestic policies, through a politically volatile electoral moment later this year, triggering unexpected public backlash, or through some entirely unforeseen combination of these compounding factors, remains genuinely impossible to predict with real precision. But what has become increasingly clear, through examining the accumulated evidence carefully and honestly, is this: a political system that has maintained power for over 2 decades primarily through carefully projected confidence, personal loyalty networks, and tightly controlled information, now increasingly resembles a structure straining significantly under pressures it was never originally designed to withstand for this long. Whether that strain eventually resolves through a dramatic sudden rupture, a quieter negotiated internal transition, or continues simply grinding forward under mounting internal tension for the foreseeable future, one underlying truth remains consistently clear throughout every part of this analysis: the foundation of unquestioned strength. This leadership spent over 2 decades carefully constructing and projecting to the world has never looked more genuinely fragile than it does right now. And history has taught us, again and again, across many different countries and many different eras, that once a foundation like that truly begins to crack beneath the surface, the eventual outcome rarely announces itself gradually or gives clear advance warning. It tends to arrive suddenly, decisively, and often when almost everyone, including those studying it most closely, least expects it. If this deeper look into what is really happening inside Russia's political system helped you understand this moment more clearly, make sure to subscribe, share this with someone who needs the full picture, and leave a comment with your own thoughts below. Stay curious, stay informed, and I will see you in the next video.